Browine Farm by A.M.Burrige. Most people with limited vocabularies such as mine would describe the house loosely and comprehensively as picturesque. But it was more than beautiful in its venerable age. It had certain subtle qualities which are called atmosphere. It invited you as you approached it along the rough and narrow road, which is ignored by those maps which are sold for the use of motorists. In the language of very old houses, it said plainly, "Come in, come in." It said "come in" to Rudge Jefferson and me. In one of the front windows there was a notice inscribed in an illiterate hand to the effect that the house was to be let and that the keys were to be obtained at the first cottage down the road. We went and got them. The woman who handed them over to us remarked that plenty of people looked over the house, but nobody ever took it. It had been empty for years. Damp and falling to pieces, I suppose, said Rudge as we returned. There's always a snag about these old places. The house, Browdean Farm it was called, stood some 30 yards back from the road, at the end of a strip of garden not much wider than its facade. Most of the building was plainly Tudor, but part of it was even earlier. Time was when it had been the property of prosperous yeomen, but now its acres had been added to those of another farm, and it stood shorn of all its land, save the small, untended gardens in front and behind, and half an acre of apple orchard. As in most houses of that description, the kitchen was the largest room. It was long and lofty, and its arched roof was supported by mighty beams which stretched across its breadth. There was a huge range with a noble oven, and one could fancy, in the old days of plenty, a score of harvesters supping there after their work, the beer and cider flowing as freely as spring brooks. To our surprise, the place showed few signs of damp, considering the length of time it had been untenanted, and it needed little in the way of repairs. There wasn't a stick of furniture in the house, but we could tell that its last occupants had been people of refinement and taste. The wallpapers upstairs, the colours of the faded prints and distempers, the presence of a bathroom, that great rarity in old farmhouses, all pointed to the probability of its having been last in the hands of an amateur of country cottages. Jefferson told me that he knew in his bones, and for once I agreed with his bones, that Nina would love the farm. He was engaged to my sister, and they were waiting until he had saved sufficient money to give them a reasonable material start in matrimony. Like most painstaking writers of no particular reputation, Jefferson had to take care of the pence and the shillings, but like Nina's, his tastes were inexpensive, and it was an understood thing that they were to live quietly together in the country. We inquired about the rent. It was astonishingly low. Jefferson had to live somewhere while he finished a book, and he was already paying storage for the furniture which he had bought. I could look forward to some months of idleness before returning to India. There was a trout stream in the neighbourhood which would keep me occupied and out of mischief, and so we laid our heads together. Jefferson didn't want a house immediately, but bargains of that sort are not everyday affairs in these hard times. Besides, with me to share expenses for the next 6 months, the cost of living at Browdean Farm would be very low, and it seemed a profitable speculation to take the house then and there on a 7-year lease. This is just what Jefferson did, or rather, the agreement was signed by both parties within a week. Rudge Jefferson and I were old enough friends to understand each other thoroughly and make allowances for each other's temperaments. We were neither of us morose, but often one or both of us would be anxious to talk. There were indefinite hours when Rudge felt either impelled or compelled to write. We found no difficulty in coming to a working agreement. We did not feel obliged to converse at meals. We could bring books to the table if we so wished. Rudge could go to his work when he chose, and I could go off fishing or otherwise amuse myself. Only when we were both inclined for companionship need we pay any attention to each other's existence. And from the April evening when we arrived, half an hour after the men with the furniture, it worked admirably. We lived practically in one room, the larger of the two front sitting rooms. There we took our meals, talked, and smoked and read. The smaller sitting room Rudge commandeered for a study. He retired thither when the spirit moved him to invoke the muses and to tap at his typewriter. Our only servant was the woman who had lately had charge of the keys. She came in every day to cook our meals and do the housework, and as for convenience we dined in the middle of the day. We had the place to ourselves immediately after tea. The garden we decided to tend ourselves, but although we began digging and planting with the early enthusiasm of most amateurs, we soon tired of the job and let wild nature take its course. Our first month was ideal and idyllic. The weather was kind and everything seemed to go in our favour. The trout gave me all the fun I could have hoped for, and Rudge was satisfied with the quality and quantity of his output. I had no difficulty in adapting myself to his little ways, and soon discovered that his best hours for working were in the mornings and the late evenings, so I left him to himself at those times. We took our last meal, a light cold supper, at about 9:30, and very often I stayed out until that hour. You mustn't think that we lived like two recluses under the same roof. Sometimes Rudge was not in the mood for work, and hinted at a desire for companionship. Then we went out for long walks, or he came to watch me fish. He was himself a ham-handed angler, and seldom attempted to throw a fly. Often we went to drink the light ale at the village inn a mile distant, and always, after supper, we smoked and talked for an hour or so before turning in. It was then, while we were sitting quietly, that we discovered that the house, which was mute by day, owned strange voices which gave tongue after dark. They were the noises which, I suppose, one ought to expect to hear in an old house half full of timber when the world around is hushed and sleeping. They might have been nerve-wracking if one of us had been there alone, but as it was, we took little notice at first. Mostly they proceeded from the kitchen, whence we heard the creaking of beams, sobbing noises, gasping noises, and queer, indescribable scufflings. Whilst neither of us believed in ghosts, we laughingly agreed that the house ought to be haunted, and by something a little more sensational than the sounds of timber contracting and the wind in the kitchen chimney. We knew ourselves to be the unwilling hosts of a colony of rats, which was in itself sufficient to account for most nocturnal noises. Rudge said that he wanted to meet the ghost of an 18th century miser who couldn't rest until he had shown where the money was hidden. There was some practical use in that sort of bogey, and although, as time went on, these night noises became louder and more persistent, We put them down to natural causes and made no effort to investigate them. It occurred to both of us that more rats had discovered a good home, and although we talked of trapping them, our talk came to nothing. We had been at the farm about a month before Rudge Jefferson began to show symptoms of nerves. All writers are the same, neurotic brutes. But I said nothing to him and waited for him to diagnose his own trouble and ease up a little with his work. It was at about that time that I, walking homewards one morning just about lunchtime with my rod over my shoulder, encountered the local policeman just outside the village inn. He wished me a good day, which was at once hearty and respectful, and at the same time passed the back of his hand over a thirsty-looking moustache. The hint was obvious, and only a heart of stone could have refrained from inviting him inside. Besides, I believe in keeping in with the police. He was one of those country constables who become fixtures in quiet, out-of-the-way districts, where they live and let live, and often go into pensioned retirement without bringing more than half a dozen cases before the petty sessions. This worthy was named Hicks, and I had already discovered that everybody liked him. He didn't look for trouble. He had rabbits from the local poachers, beer from local cyclists who rode after dark without lights, and more beer from the landlord who chose to exercise his own discretion with regard to closing time. P.C. Hicks drank a pint of bitter with me and gave me his best respects. He asked me how we were getting on up at the farm. Admirably, I told him, and then he looked at me closely, as if to see if I was sincere, or rather, to search my eyes for the passing of some afterthought. Having found me guileless, as it seemed, he went on to tell me of his length of service. He'd been 18 years on the one beat, and of how little trouble he had been to anybody. There was something pathetic in the protestations of the middle-aged Bobby, that to all the world he had been a man and a brother. He seemed tacitly to be asking for reciprocity, and his own vagueness drew me out of my depth. You know those beautifully vague men who pride themselves for being diplomatists on the principle that a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. The people who will hint and hint and hint. The asses who will wander round and round and round the haystack with hardly a nibble at it. He was one of them. He wanted to tell me something without actually telling me, to exact from me a promise about something he chose not to mention. I had found myself in dialectical tangles with him, and at last I laughingly gave up the task of trying to follow his labyrinthine thoughts. I ordered 2 more bitters, and then he said, "Well, sir, if anything happens up at the farm, you needn't get talking about it. We done our best. What's past is past, and can't be altered. There ain't no sense in setting people against us." I knew from his inflection on the word that us was the police. He didn't look at me while he spoke. He was staring at something straight across the counter, and I happened, by sheer chance, to follow the direction of his gaze. Opposite us, and hanging from a shelf so as to face the customers, was a little tear-off calendar. The date recorded there was the 19th of May. 2 evenings later, which is to say, the evening of May 21st, I returned home at 9:30, full of suppressed excitement. I had a story to tell Rudge, and I was yet not sure if I should be wise in telling it. His nerves had grown worse during the last 2 days. But after all, there are nerves and nerves, and my tale might interest him without harming. It was only just dusk, and not a tithe of the stars were burning as I walked up the garden path, inhaling the rank scents of those hardy flowers which had sprung up untended in the miniature wilderness. The sitting-room window was dark, but the subdued light of an oil lamp burned behind the curtains of Rudge's study. I found the door unbarred, walked in, and entered the study. You see, it was supper time, and Rudge might safely be intruded upon. Rather to my surprise, the room was empty, but I surmised that Rudge had gone up to wash. That he had lately been at work was evident from the fact that a sheet of paper, half used, lay in the roller of the typewriter. I sat down in the revolving chair to see what he had written. I was allowed that privilege, and was astonished to see that he had ended in the middle of a sentence. In some respects, he was a methodical person, and this was unlike him. The last word he had written was "thee," and the last letter of that word was black and prominent, as if he had slammed down the key with unnecessary force. 2 minutes later, while I was still reading, a probable explanation was revealed to me. I heard the gate click and footfalls on the path. Naturally, I guessed that Rudge, temperamental as he was, had suddenly tired of his work and gone out for a walk. I heard the footsteps come to within a few yards of the house, whence they left the path, fell softer on grass and weeds, and approached the window. The curtain obscured my view, but on the glass I heard the tap of fingertips and the clink of nails. I did not pause to reflect that Rudge, if he had gone out, must know that he had left the door on the latch, or that he could have no reason to suppose I was already in the house. One doesn't consider these things in so brief a time. I just called out, "Right-ho," and went round to the front door to let him in. Having opened the front door, I leaned out and saw him, Rudge, I imagined, peering in at the study window. He was no more than a dark, bent shadow in the dusk, crowned by a soft felt hat such as he generally wore. "Right-o," I said again, and leaving the door wide open for him, I hurried into the kitchen. There was some salad left in to soak, which had to be shaken and wiped before bringing it to table. I remember that as I walked through to the sink, one of the beams over my head creaked noisily. I washed the salad and returned to the dining room. As I turned into the hall, a gust of air from the still open door passed like a cool caress across my face. Then, before I had time to enter the dining room, I heard the gate click at the end of the garden path, and footfalls on the gravel. I waited to see who it was. It was Rudge, and he was bareheaded. He produced a book at supper, and sat scowling at it over his left arm while he ate. This was permitted by our rules, but I had something to tell him, and after a while I forced my voice upon his attention. "Rudge," I said, "I've made a discovery this evening. I know how you got this place so cheap." He sat up with a start, stared at me, and winced. "How?" he demanded. "This is Stanley Stride's old house. Don't you remember Stanley Stride?" He was pale already, but I saw him turn paler still. I remember the name vaguely, he said. Wasn't he a murderer? He was, I answered. I don't remember the case very well, but my memory's been refreshed today. Everybody here thought we knew, and that curious delicacy of the bucolic mind forbade mentioning it to us. It was rather a grisly business, and the odd thing is that local opinion is all in favour of Stride's innocence, although he was hanged. Rudge's eyes had grown larger. I remember the name, he said, but I forget the case. Tell me. Well, Stanley Stride was an artist who took this place. He was what we would call in common parlance a dirty dog. He'd got himself entangled with the daughter of a neighbouring farmer, the family's left here since, and then he found himself morally and socially compelled to marry her. At the same time, he fell in love with another girl, so he lured the old one here and did her in. Do you remember now? Rudge wrinkled his nose. Yes, vaguely, he said. Didn't he bury the body and afterwards try to make out she'd committed suicide? So this is the house, is it? Funny nobody told us before. They thought we knew, I repeated, and nobody liked to mention it, as if it was some disgrace to us, you know. Oh, and of course, the house is haunted. Rudge stared at me and frowned. I don't know about haunted, he said, but it's been a damned uncomfortable house to sit in for the past few evenings. I mean at twilight, when I've been waiting for you. My nerves have been pretty raw lately. Tonight I couldn't stand it, so I went out for a stroll. Left in the middle of a sentence, I remarked. Oh, so you noticed that, did you? By the way, I asked, what made you go out the second time? I didn't. Oh, but my dear chap, you did, because the first time you came in you wore a hat, and 2 minutes later I saw you walking up the garden path without one. That's when I did come back. I haven't worn a hat at all this evening. Then who? I began. And that reminds me, he continued quickly. When you come in of an evening, you needn't sneak up to the window and tap on it with your fingers. It doesn't frighten me, but it's disconcerting. You can always walk into the room to let me know you've come back. I sat up and looked at him and laughed. But my dear chap, I haven't done such a thing yet. You old liar, he exclaimed with an uneasy laugh. You've been doing it every evening for the past week, until tonight when I didn't give you the chance. I swear I haven't, Rudge, but if you thought that, it explains why you did the same thing to me tonight. I saw from his face that I had made some queer mistake, and interrupted his denial to ask, Then who was the man I saw peeping in at the window? I saw him from the door. I thought you'd tapped on the window to be let in, not knowing that the door was open. So I went round and saw him. I thought it was you, and called out, Righto. We looked at each other again, and laughed uneasily. It seems we've got our ghost after all, Rudge said half-jestingly. Or somebody's trying to pull our leg, I amended. I don't know that I should fancy meeting the ghost of a murderer, but joking apart, the house has been getting on my nerves of late, and those noises we've always heard have been getting louder and more mysterious lately. As if to corroborate a statement which needed no evidence as far as I was concerned, we heard a scuffling sound from the kitchen, followed by the loud creaking of timber. We laughed again, puzzled, uneasy laughter, for the thing was still half a joke. There you are, said Rudge, and got up. I'm going to investigate this. He crossed the room and suddenly halted. I knew why. Then he turned about with an odd, shamed chuckle. "No," he said, "there's no sense in it. I shall find nothing there. And why should I pander to my nerves?" I had nothing to say, but I knew that in turning back he was pandering to cowardice, because just then I would have done almost anything rather than enter that kitchen. Had anybody asked me then whether murder was done, I could have told them with as much certainty as if I had just been reading about it in the papers. Rudge sat down again. "Don't laugh at me," he said. "I know this is all rot, but I've got a hideous feeling that things hidden and unseen around us are moving steadily to a crisis." "Cheerful brute," I said, smiling. "I know. It's only my nerves, of course. I don't want to infect you with them. But the noises we hear, and the fellow who comes and taps at the window, they want some explaining away, don't they?" "Especially now that we know somebody was murdered here," I agreed. "I'm beginning to wish we didn't know about that." Rudge went to bed early that night, but I sat up reading. As often happens to me, I fell asleep over my book, and when I woke, I was almost in darkness, for the lamp needed filling. The last jagged blue flame swelled and dwindled, fluttering like a moth and tapping against the glass. And as I watched it, I became suddenly aware of the cause of my waking. I had heard the latch snap on the garden gate, and in that moment I began to hear them. The footfalls. I heard the rhythmic crunch of gravel, and then the swish of long grass and plantains. And then a shadow nodded on the blind. It loomed up large and suddenly became stationary. A loose pane rattled under the impact of fingers. Perhaps there was a moon, perhaps not, but there was at least bright starlight in the world outside. The drawn blind looked like dim bluish glass, and the shadow of something outside was cut as cleanly as a silhouette clipped away with scissors. I saw only the head and shoulders of a man who wore a dented felt hat. His head lolled over onto his left shoulder, just as I had always imagined a man's head would loll, if he had been hanged. And I knew in my blood that he was a horror, and that he wanted me for something. I felt my hair bristle, and suddenly I was streaming with sweat. I don't remember turning and running, but I have a vague recollection of cannoning off the doorpost and stumbling into the hall. And when I reached my bed, I don't know if I fainted or fell asleep. No, I didn't tell Rudge next day. His nerves were in a bad enough state already. Besides, in the fresh glory of a May morning, it was easy to persuade myself that the episode had been but an evil dream. But I did question Mrs. Janes, our charwoman, when she arrived, and I saw a look, half stubborn and half guilty, cross her face. Yes, of course, she remembered the murder happening, but she didn't remember much about it. Mr. Stride was quite a nice gentleman, although rather a one for the ladies, and she'd worked for him sometimes. Stride's defence was that the poor girl had committed suicide, and that he'd lost his head and buried the body when he found it. Lots of people thought it was true, but they'd hanged Mr. Stride for it all the same. And that was all I could get out of Mrs. Janes. I smiled grimly to myself, as if the woman didn't remember every detail, as if the neighbourhood had talked of anything else for the 2 following years. And then I remembered the policeman's strange words, and how he had been staring at the calendar while he spoke. So that morning, when I called at the inn for my usual glass of beer, I too looked at the calendar and asked the landlord if he could tell me the date of the murder. "Yes, sir," he said. "It was May the—" And then he stopped himself. "Why, it was 8 years ago tonight," he said. I went out again that evening and came in at the usual hour. But that evening, Rudge came down the path to meet me. He was white and sick-looking. "He's been here again," he said, "half an hour ago." "You saw him this time?" I said jerkily. "Yes, I did as you did and went round to the door." He paused and added quite soberly, "He is a ghost, you know." "What happened?" I asked, looking uneasily around me. "Oh, I went round to the door when I heard him tapping at the window, and there he was, as you saw him yesterday evening, trying to look through into the room. He must have heard me, for he turned and stared. His head was drooping all on one side, like a poppy on a broken stem. He came towards me, and I couldn't stand that, so I turned and ran into the house and locked the door." He spoke in a tone half weary, half matter-of-fact. And suddenly I knew that it was all true. I don't mean that I knew that just his story was true. I knew that the house was haunted, and that the thing which we had both seen was part of the man who had once been Stanley Stride. When once one has accepted the hitherto incredible, it is strange how soon one can adapt oneself to the altered point of view. "This is the anniversary of the murder," I said quietly. "I should think something worse will happen tonight. Shall we see it through, or shall we beat it?" And almost in a whisper Rudge said, "Poor devil, oughtn't one to pity. He wants to tell us something, you know." "Yes," I agreed, "or show us something." Together we walked into the house. We were braver in each other's company, and we did not again discuss the problem of going or staying. We stayed. I can pass over the details of how we spent that evening. They have no importance to the story. We were left in peace until just after 11 o'clock, when once more we heard the garden gate being opened and footfalls, which by this time we were able to recognise, coming up the path and through the long grass to the window. We could see nothing, for our lamp was alight, but I knew what it looked like, the thing that stood outside and now tapped softly upon the glass. And in spite of having Rudge for company, I lost my head and screamed at it. "Get back to hell! Get back to hell, I tell you!" I heard myself shout. And it was Rudge the sensitive neurotic, who kept his head, for human psychology is past human understanding. "No," he called out in a thin quaver. Come in if we can help you." And then, as if regretting his courage on the instant, He caught my hand and held it, drawing me towards him. The front door was locked, but it was no barrier to that which responded to the invitation. We heard slow footfalls shuffling through the hall, the footfalls, it seemed to me, of a man whose head was a burden to him. I died 1,000 deaths as they approached the door of our room, but they passed and died away up the passage, and then I heard a whisper from Rudge. He's gone through into the kitchen. I think he wants us to follow. And as I went, the sweat from the roots of my stiffened hair ran down my cheeks. The kitchen door was closed, and we halted outside it, both of us breathing as if we'd been running hard. Then Rudge held his breath for a moment, lifted the latch, and took a quick step across the threshold. And in that same instant he froze my chilled blood with a scream such as I had heard in wartime from a wounded horse. He had almost fainted when he fell into my arms, but he had the presence of mind to pull the door after him, so that I saw nothing. I half dragged, half carried him into the dining room and gave him some brandy. And suddenly I became aware that a great peace had settled upon the house. I can only liken it to the freshness and the sweetness of the earth after a storm has passed. Rudge felt it too, for presently he began to talk. What was he doing? I asked in a whisper. He wasn't there, not in the kitchen. Not in the kitchen, then what? Who? It was she. Only she. She was kicking and struggling from the middle beam, you know, and there was an overturned chair at her feet. He shuddered convulsively. She was worse than he said presently. Far worse. And then, later, poor devil. So he didn't do it, you see? Next morning we had it out with Mrs. Janes, and we did not permit her memory to be hazy or defective. She must have known that we had seen something, and presently she burst into tears. He said he'd found her hanging in the kitchen, poor gentleman, and that he'd buried her because he was afraid people would say he'd done it. But the jury wouldn't believe him, and the doctors all said it wasn't true, and that the marks round her neck were where he'd strangled her with a rope. I don't believe to this day he did it, I don't. But nothing can't ever bring him back. She paused at that, and added, not back to life, I mean. Real life, like you and me, I mean. And that was all we heard, and all we wished to hear. Afterwards, Rudge said to me, for his sake, the truth as we know it ought to be told to everybody. I suppose the police know. Yes, I said, the police know now, but as Mrs. Janes said, it can't bring him back. Who wants to bring him back? Exclaimed Rudge with a shudder. But perhaps if people knew, as we know, it might let him rest. I'm sure that's what he wanted. Just that people should know. He paused and drew a long breath through his lips. You write it, he said jerkily. I can't. And so I have.